right, hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening. We are 41 days away from the fourth Israeli elections in, a year and a half. And we're going to focus a little bit on what's going on, really, on the political map. As the blurb suggested, the majority of the parties are what would be on the ideological right. I think it was 5 out of the 6 parties, or let's say 5 out of the 7 parties which are polling best at the moment could certainly be seen as parties on the ideological right or the religious right, and would certainly seem to fit very nicely into a right-wing religious bloc, which was always a sort of stable bloc and could be relied on. In fact, as many pollsters have pointed out, in theory, the religious right bloc would be able to cobble together a coalition for 80 seats, which is well above the 61 needed, and possibly, or in theory at least, should be one of the most stable Israeli governments in recent history, certainly probably in the last couple of decades. I mean, to have 2/3 of the Knesset, to have a majority of 2/3 would certainly give any government a lot of wiggle room. You've got pretty much every single party, apart from the Likud, in such a coalition that could vote against the government on a certain issue and they would still have a majority. The question is, why aren't we seeing such a thing? Or really, it comes down to one thing at the end of the day. The reason why there isn't this right-wing religious coalition is personality. At least 2, possibly 3 parties. We'll have to wait and see exactly where Yamina come down after the elections, but at least 2 parties that are ostensibly on the right and would sit very nicely in a right-wing coalition in theory, will not sit under Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. That's Gideon Saar's New Hope party and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party. Gideon Saar, as we know, came from the Likud. He left only months ago and he'd sat in the Likud for many years, had been a close advisor to Netanyahu for many years. Avigdor Lieberman was the Director General of the Likud party, was Director General of the Prime Minister's office under Netanyahu. We look at Naftali Bennett, who has said he will not at this point support either camps. And when you see the polls, usually it's right and left bloc, but today we see those who could sit with Netanyahu and those who will not. And sometimes Bennett is put with the could sit with Netanyahu because he said he's open to it. He hasn't made a decision. Sometimes he's put as separate. Naftali Bennett is another one who was the chief of staff to Netanyahu at one point. So we see really this comes down to personality. And if you look at the wider picture, these elections are again a referendum on the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. The interesting thing is the blocs again. We just had another poll tonight. Israeli pollsters are making a lot of money because I don't think that there's more than 2 days without a different poll. And really, the polls aren't massively different, but the little details matter. And I'll explain why. At the moment, according to the most recent poll by Channel 12, tonight, Netanyahu with the ultra-Orthodox parties, plus the Bezalel Smotrich's party with Itamar Ben-Gvir, the extreme right religious party, plus Naftali Bennett, if he decides to go with Netanyahu after, only make 59. Now, 59, as we know, you can't make a coalition because you're outnumbered. The other bloc obviously has 61. And again, we're talking about, first of all, there's 9 from the Arab Party there, which could oppose a government, but certainly wouldn't fit comfortably within a government. So both sides need one character at this point. Naftali Bennett has become a kingmaker. no side could even get close to a coalition without Naftali Bennett. And he's in a very, very good position tonight. And it's no coincidence that Netanyahu put out on his favorite channel, which is Channel 20, which is very pro him, and basically, a lot of softball questions in their interviews, basically asked him about the potential of having another rotation agreement with the prime minister, which, as we know, he currently has with Benny Gantz, where he ruled it out. He said it doesn't work. You can only have one prime minister, and this idea will not be brought up again. So he wanted to dampen the expectation from Naftali Bennett and anyone in his camp that he could be given rotation. There's been a lot of whispers from that camp that they would only go with a government that would offer rotation. And in his case, because he's seen the way Benny Gantz has been treated, he would argue to be first. Now, at the moment, he's polling around 11 seats. Now, is it possible that a prime minister could have 11 seats? There'd have to be at least 50 from other parties. That would be pretty unworkable, pretty difficult to manage. But it's Naftali Bennett, as I said, without him, neither side even has a hope of a coalition. So he basically has an extremely strong hand. But Netanyahu has said that he's taking at this point the issue of having an alternative prime minister, as he has with Gantz, off the table. Other issues are, because there's no ideological differences between, let's say, Netanyahu, Assar, to a certain extent, Naftali Bennett, to a slightly lesser extent, Avigdor Lieberman, and to even slightly lesser extent, Yair Lapid. On security issues, yes, there are differences, but those are certainly not being placed front and center, far from it. On economic issues, there's not that much difference. So really, the focus at this point from the Netanyahu camp is trying to create this difference. Basically, his strategy is saying it's either me or Yair Lapid. Now, to a certain extent, there's something true to that, because if the anti-Netanyahu camp does get together, they have said, or at least Avigdor Lieberman has said, who's very much part of that camp, that the prime ministerial candidate will be the leader of the largest party of that camp. And at the moment, it is very much Yair Lapid. Tonight's results gave him 20 seats, and the next greatest on that, next largest on that block is 13. So I don't think that will be a gap that will be made smaller. I think, if anything, it would just become greater over time. So that would mean Yair Lapid would be ostensibly the leader of that bloc and would be the prime ministerial candidate of that bloc. So what Netanyahu is cleverly trying to do is not so much go after Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett, where they have very little ideological differences, especially as he'll probably need at least one of them, if not both of them, after the elections, but trying to create this artificial ideological difference, that Yair Lapid is this left-winger, knowing that these are not really the issues, but trying to make that difference. It's a very clever strategy. But on the other hand, Gideon Sa'ar, especially, and Naftali Bennett to a slightly lesser extent, are going very heavy on Netanyahu's failures, as they would describe it, on the coronavirus, on handling the pandemic, and on the economy. So much so that Gideon Sa'ar kind of came out with a little bit of a bombshell, where he said that after the next elections, he will call for a national inquiry, an official state inquiry into the handling of the pandemic. And as he put it in his campaign videos, the fact that this government is costing thousands of Israelis their lives, hundreds of thousands of Israelis their jobs, businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So to call for a national state inquiry into the handling of the pandemic is certainly going very tough. And there was a very clever video today which sort of discredited Minister of Transportation, Miri Regev, for her perceived failures to close the airports in time. And there's a lot of discussion around that. Exactly, what should have been done? Should that have been done months ago? There's a lot of the public which feel that certainly it should have been. So basically, there's a lot of disappointment with the handling by the government. But, and this is the interesting thing, and this is what Benjamin Netanyahu's pollsters will be telling him regularly, and he knows it very well himself, that despite the perceived failings, there is still no one in Israel who is perceived as more, let's say, popular or more capable as being prime minister. when polls are taken of him head to head against Gideon Saar, against Lapid, and against Bennett, he wins by quite a bit. The gap with Lapid is closing, but with the other two, it's just not even a close contest. So the majority of Israelis do still see, and they still have this sort of, there's this feeling that no one else can run this country, which is something that Netanyahu plays on very well, even though the country as a whole, the public, seem to be extremely disappointed with the running of the country, and they think that there are failures across with the health system, the education system, social affairs, transportation, as I said, et cetera, et cetera. But for a large group of Israelis, Netanyahu is still the only game in town, and that's something which is very much in his favor, as we see in the polls. One interesting element of a poll that was undertaken by, I think, the Israel Democracy Institute, when they asked people, and this is very important for anyone who has ever worked in elections, is, you know, in a regular poll, they ask you who you're most likely to vote if the elections were held today, and you give your choice. But in this poll, and which, as I said, someone who's worked in elections will be asking these questions a lot, how likely are you to turn out and vote on the day for your chosen party? And one of the lowest amounts is Likud. Some of the parties have 75%, 80%. Some of the ultra-Orthodox parties have even 90% likelihood. So they know that they're pretty confident and they know the numbers that they're getting. The Likud's numbers, according to the survey at least, were around 53%. That's extremely significant. That shows that there certainly isn't that passion amongst Likud voters to really get to the polls on the day. Again, we've got 41 days, and Netanyahu will be reading these polls very carefully, and he'll be taking his own polls, and he'll understand the pulse of his public, and he'll be making sure that he'll do everything, and he's very good at that, as he's shown in the past, to try and really motivate his base. And that's really where it matters. And just to get back to the initial point is, this election, as we've said in the past, will be won and lost by narrow margins. According to the poll tonight that we talked about, all the parties pretty much are supposed to pass the lower threshold and make it into the Knesset. Meretz, Blue and White, which are hovering very close, and some polls put them under. The Ram party, as we talked about, the Islamist Muslim party, is not expected to get across the threshold. I think there was one poll out of the last 20 that I've seen that expects it to, but there are some commentators which suggest that that may be a surprise. The religious Zionist, the far right religious Zionist list, most polls say it will pass the threshold, but there have been one or two that haven't. If one of these falls on one side or the other, it changes the map, because those, as I said, those, as we've talked about before, those votes get sort of thrown away, as it were, and everything then gets thrown back into the mix, as it were. So really, you know, if Blue and White don't make it, or Meretz don't make it, or Ram do make it, or the religious Zionist party do not make it, this changes everything. So the numbers are very tight at this moment, but with 41 days to go, there's still so much in play. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions about this or anything else.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is, which party would be the best suited to deal with the Biden administration?
That's a good question. First of all, there will not be one party that will govern. If it's going to be this anti-Bibi bloc, then it would remain to be seen. But I mean, I think that it's probable that the Americans would prefer to deal with anyone but Netanyahu. As we've seen in the last few years, Netanyahu has placed himself very much in a partisan place in American politics, and likewise, you know, there were posters here in subsequent elections. You know, one of Likud's main campaign posters had Netanyahu standing next to former President Donald Trump, and there were all these gestures just before the elections by the Trump administration to help Netanyahu get the numbers that he did in previous elections. So the partisan nature of politics towards Israel is something that I'm sure, you know, the Biden administration that still has yet, or at least at the presidential level, has yet to call Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think is is a statement in itself. So I think probably anyone but Netanyahu at this point would be something that the Biden administration would prefer and probably work better with it. But at the end of the day, you know, it's a bit of a saying, but there is a certain amount of truism that the relationship between America and Israel is beyond partisan politics. Biden and Bibi know each other. They've known each other for decades. They may not agree on many issues, but there is a respect there. There is an understanding there, and I'm sure that regardless of who wins the next elections, you know, the relationship will be solid, and hopefully it can move forward in a clever and a natural and a strategic manner.
Thank you. And we have multiple viewers asking, will Biden not calling Netanyahu have an effect on the election? And what exactly is the significance of this?
There's been a bit of a debate about that over here, exactly what that means. It hasn't played out as much. It's certainly you know, sort of, as I said, the Trump card was Trump in the previous elections, which Netanyahu can't use anymore. And he's certainly not going as much on his relationship with foreign leaders as he did in previous elections. He is talking about issues, the normalization agreements, et cetera, but the longer it goes on and the more sort of background noise comes around, there will be some talk and, you know, there'll be some mutterings about it. But at this point, as I said, that the focus really is on the coronavirus and the economy and the government's handling of it. Now, as I said, you know, there is this feeling that Likud and Netanyahu campaign like to show that he is the indispensable leader. So the fact that the leader of the free world, Israel's greatest ally, haven't even bothered to pick up the phone to the prime minister at this point, although there have been conversations obviously at other levels. The foreign minister has spoken with the Secretary of State at least 2 occasions. But I think there's a message there, and whether that will affect the vote, I doubt too much. I can't see too many Likud voters for that being an issue for too many Likud voters, but it's certainly not, it's not giving Bibi the card that he's played in previous elections that certainly helped him get to the numbers that he did.
So has Netanyahu's legal problems had any effect on the election?
That's a good point. I didn't mention it, but this week Netanyahu was back in court for a very short amount of time, 20 minutes, and all he did was basically affirm what his lawyers said was a plea of not guilty to the charges made against him. It was a bit of a media storm in a teacup a little bit here. All the major channels had massive programs really trying to dissect everything from the legal to the political elements. There were, crowds. There was a relatively big anti-Bibi crowd outside screaming and shouting, and very little pro-Bibi. The truth is he did himself call on his supporters not to turn up to the court. But at the end, I don't think it had too much of an influence. There were a few images coming out of there. There was no evidence. We're not going to get into the sort of meat of the charges, possibly until after the elections. Bibi's lawyers very much are trying to put it off. There's been a lot of pressure. Yariv Levin, the Speaker of the Knesset, came out and said it would be seen as an interference in our political system to have this start the trial in earnest before the elections. The case against that is when you have election after election, then you basically never have a court case, and it even gives a sort of incentive to have more and more elections as we go along. But it does seem that there's still a few bureaucratic processes to go through, and according to the justice's decision, or at least what they said in court, it does seem like they'll put it off for at least a couple of months, and that could be till after the elections, but we're still waiting for the official decision on various procedural issues from the justices. It'll be very important if they do start the evidence and the witness, the giving of witness testimonials before the elections, and a lot of that is then transcribed to the newspapers, radio, TV, then it certainly could have an effect. But what many commentators have said is, this trial's been going on for a while. We've known about it already for 3 elections. there's nothing really new at this point, at least. Maybe deep into the trial, but there'll be some new revelations, but probably not before these elections. So those who believe that he's guilty and that this is a witch hunt, not guilty and this is a witch hunt, which is definitely the talking points of the Likud party, will continue to believe so. And those who believe that he is, quote unquote, what they call him, the crime minister, and someone up to his ears in corruption, will continue believing that. There's very few people in Israel at this point who probably haven't made up their mind about it. I can't imagine there's many of them. And if there are, I'm not sure if that's going to be such an issue if they're really not invested in that. So at this point, most commentators are saying that unless something happens before the elections, it's probably not going to be an issue.
Understood. Thank you. So with coronavirus being such a large issue at this time, do any of the competing parties actually have a very clear policy on this, lockdowns, quarantines, travel, et cetera?
Yes. Don't make me go into the details. I have read some of them. The sharpest, let's say, is probably from Naftali Bennett. He's been saying for quite a while he would deal with it without lockdowns. He said if given responsibility, he would have the whole thing done within a month. That's what he said a number of months ago. All the major candidates pretty much have a plan, except for the Likud. Likud have historically, at least in recent history, never put out a manifesto or a vision. So it's quite amazing in Western democracies that the ruling party doesn't even put out any written material about what they plan to do after the elections, but that's the way it's been for a number of years. Yes, there are various plans. I would certainly not want to state them because I don't want to, I'll do them in injustice. Most of them have been put out in English, so you can search for them, but there have been plans by all the major players exactly how they would deal with it, because they feel that is a point where the public is angry, is disappointed. You actually even have, tomorrow we'll see if it comes to fruition, but there's talk of restaurants, hotels, shopping malls opening despite the restrictions, to say we've had enough. That could be a very interesting element, and the police are certainly ready for it. A lot of the owners of these businesses are saying, and even cultural events, they're saying, well, the ultra-Orthodox world, we've seen that they've been allowed to go about their business with weddings, with funerals, with the schools open, with shops open. If you go to Mea Shearim, which is an ultra-Orthodox stronghold, you'll see life as normal, shops open, restaurants, whatever, schools. So they're saying, well, why should the police suddenly come down on us? So that could be very interesting to see exactly. That would be a bit of a test for Netanyahu. Netanyahu has already instructed his Minister of Interior to clamp down on those. But then you can imagine how those images will be seen side by side with the ultra-Orthodox, which have barely had a police presence, and certainly not too many fines or arrests being made in that community. So there's still a lot to talk about with the coronavirus and the government's response to it. But exactly what the other parties would do, it's not simply they're bashing the government. I don't want that to be the idea given here. They have got plans, they have got well formulated plans, but I would really guide everyone to look through those by themselves.
Thank you. So we've been getting reports that the vaccination rates have dropped off. How is the government trying to reverse this trend?
Yes, there was a time where Israel was vaccinating around 150,000 a day, even more at some point. And these days it's around 60,000. There's been a massive drop off, considering, that the lines and the expectation and the needs around the world. It's quite amazing that Israel has images and videos of empty centers where people have the vaccine ready to give out and people are just not coming in. There is a growing, many people didn't think there was, but there is a growing skepticism. There's been some high level, there was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who is considered the rabbi to many celebrities, and he came out and basically came up with these conspiracies about the vaccine. It creates fertility, it's this, it's that, the other usual conspiracies. And you have a few celebrities, and he has a Facebook following of hundreds of thousands. So not to say that he's solely responsible, there are many different things. There's a feeling amongst the younger public that they don't really need it, so why take a risk? But what the government is doing, and I think this is certainly the correct response, is trying to incentivize a sort of carrot and the stick. They're saying that when you get your second inoculation, a week later, you can apply for what's called a green passport, which basically says that you're inoculated. It's an official thing with a QR code, et cetera, et cetera. And they're saying that if you have one of these, you can enter malls, restaurants, cultural, sporting events, traveling abroad without isolation, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't, you won't be able to do any of these things. They're saying gyms, and they're trying to really incentivize and say, it's not worth your while not getting it. There's even talk of Yuli Edelstein, the Minister of Health, came out today and said that they're looking into a law that would allow businesses to ensure that all their employees are inoculated. Basically saying, if you want to continue working for us, you have to be inoculated. At the moment, no one can do that. No one can force anyone to do that. And there's also talk in the education system, whether you can force teachers to get inoculated. There's some cities like Yavne, which have basically said that we will not allow any teachers into our schools or kindergarten system who have not been inoculated. But again, at this point in time, it's not legal to do that, but the government is certainly looking into ways to trying to see if they can legislate for that. And interestingly enough, the Attorney General has given a sort of a tentative approval for the concept that would be. So that's, as you can imagine, very controversial, because in Israel, like many other places, it's extremely rare, if ever, that the government can enforce a particular medical response, whether it's a vaccination or otherwise. So we'll see exactly how that plays out in the next few days.
So along those lines, with Netanyahu getting a lot of kudos because of the vaccination rollout, has that pride now dissipated since the rates are going lower?
Well, something that Netanyahu certainly brings up. I mean, in theory, we're out of the lockdown because some of the restrictions were eased, but the education system is only starting to go back tomorrow. They're reintroducing what they call the traffic light system. So cities which are green and yellow, we actually have 4 lights in our traffic light system. We have green, yellow, orange, and red. Only green and yellow are going back from 1st to 4th grade and kindergartens, but that's about 1/3 of the country. So we're still seeing hundreds of thousands of kids staying home for at least another week, if not more. And there's talk that the middle sort of grades from the age of 12 until 16 won't go back for at least another month and a half, where we're past the Purim holiday, on our way to the Pesach holiday, and pretty much the year's almost ended after that. So, people are just really, really distraught about, having the kids are still missing out on more education. Businesses are still shuttering every day. People are still in unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So the initial excitement over the vaccine has dissipated. The fact that many centers around the country are empty, or, certainly a trickle than it was at first. So that's dissipated to a certain extent, but the government is trying very hard to sort of kick that up, and it's talking about benchmarks, trying to reach benchmarks. At the moment, I think we have 3.5 million people who've had the first vaccine, 2.5 million with the second vaccine, but they're talking about at least getting to 4 million, and 90% of those over the age of 50, which obviously are the most likely if they have COVID, to have the worst symptoms. So those are benchmarks which the government's trying to do, and certainly trying to put the vaccine back on the front foot and ensure that Israel remains ahead of the world percentage-wise.
Thank you. And has there been any update with the variant that has come through?
Which variant? There's quite a few, but yeah, I mean, basically they're saying that considering we had a lockdown, considering we have the fastest vaccination program in the world, the numbers are going down extremely slowly, and they're blaming that on the variants, mutations, whatever you want to call it. There is a certain, that's what's happening. Although they say that the Pfizer vaccine, which is what everyone in Israel has taken, seems to be good for those variants or mutations at this point. And hospital records and surveys that they've done through various health services are showing that the vaccine is working. That's the bottom line. They're showing that those who've had the vaccine are simply not getting ill, not even close to the numbers of those who haven't. So the bottom line is that Israel is this test case. And so far, the good news from Israel to the world is that the vaccines are having a tremendous effect. But definitely the mutations are slowing that down a little bit because they're spreading and it's a race between the mutations of the vaccines. But it seems one that slowly but surely the vaccines will win out. But we'll obviously have more information in the coming weeks and months.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Tariq Fatah discussing Islamism in the West, how we got here, how we defeat it. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.